The night was not quiet. It never was out there along the Guadalupe River in the summer of 1840. The insects carried on in that low, relentless roar that fills the Texas hill country after dark, and the horses tied at the edge of camp stamped and shifted against their ropes, restless the way horses get when something is moving in the dark that they can smell and the men holding their reins cannot. Captain John Coffee Hayes was 22 years old. He had been in Texas for 3 years. He was slight, dark-haired, unremarkable in the way that genuinely dangerous men sometimes are, and he was sitting on the ground with his back against a live oak tree, not sleeping, listening to the country around him the way a man learns to listen when the country has been trying to kill him long enough that silence begins to feel like a warning. There were maybe 15 men in that camp. Some were volunteers, frontier settlers who had ridden out because their neighbors' cattle were gone or their neighbors were gone. Some were what passed for Rangers in 1840, which is to say men who had agreed to ride and fight for the Republic of Texas at $8 a month when the Treasury actually had $8, which was not always. They were not a standing army. They were not a professional force in any sense that officers in Washington or Mexico City would have recognized. They were something harder to define and, as it turned out, harder to defeat. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you, what they were riding into, and what they did not yet fully understand they were riding into was not a border skirmish. It was not a cattle dispute that had gotten out of hand. It was the forward edge of a conflict that had been building for a decade, and that would not be resolved for another 35 years. A conflict between the Republic of Texas and the Comanche Nation at the absolute height of Comanche power on the Southern Plains. The Rangers who rode out that summer were, in almost every measurable way, outgunned, outmanned, and outmatched. They knew some of this. They did not know all of it. And what they learned in the months and years that followed those first engagements, learned the hard way, on horseback and on foot, and sometimes on the ground, would change both peoples in ways that neither side had asked for and neither side could take back. To understand what the Rangers were walking into, you have to understand what the Comanche Nation was in 1840. Not what the dime novels said. Not what the Hollywood Westerns would eventually show. The actual historical nation, the one that Comanche scholars and historians like Pekka Hamalainen have spent careers reconstructing from Spanish archives, Mexican dispatches, American military reports, and Comanche oral tradition. What those sources describe is not a people living at the margins of civilization. What they describe is an empire. Hamalainen, in his landmark 2008 study, uses that word deliberately. Empire. At its height in the 1840s, Comancheria, the territory the Comanche controlled, raided across, and taxed by their presence, covered most of present-day West Texas, the eastern half of New Mexico, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and stretches of Kansas and Colorado. The Comanche had driven the Apache off the southern plains in the early 1700s. They had fought the Spanish to a standstill and then to terms. They had raided deep into Mexico, sometimes within sight of the suburbs of Monterrey. They were, by any honest accounting, the dominant military power on the southern plain for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, and they had been so long before the Republic of Texas declared itself a nation in 1836. The Comanche were not simply skilled fighters. That framing misses the scale of what they had built. They were horse people in a way that no other nation on the continent quite matched. Their horsemanship began in infancy. Boys rode before they walked independently. A Comanche warrior at full gallop could drop to the offside of his horse, hanging by one heel and one hand from the mane, and fire arrows from under the horse's neck at targets on the ground. Observers who watched this in combat described it as nearly impossible to understand, let alone counter. George Catlin, who traveled among the Comanche in the 1830s and painted them from life, wrote that on horseback they were the most extraordinary riders in the world. He was not prone to exaggeration. Their bows, drawn from horseback at speed, sent arrows with enough force to pass entirely through a buffalo or, as Texas settlers had learned to their grief, through a man. In the time it took a ranger to reload a single-shot flintlock pistol, a Comanche warrior could put 12 to 15 arrows in the air. That arithmetic did not favor the Rangers. It had not favored anyone before 1840. The summer of 1840 sits inside a longer story of escalating violence that had begun almost the moment Anglo settlers started arriving in Texas in the 1820s. Stephen F. Austin's first colonists had established themselves in the eastern part of the territory, along the Brazos and Colorado rivers, in country the Comanche used but did not heavily occupy. For a few years, the two peoples kept an uneasy distance. By the 1830s, that distance was gone. The line of settlement had pushed west into the hill country, into the Edwards Plateau, into the southern reaches of the Llano Estacado. These are not the margins of Comancheria. These were its heartlands. And the Comanche responded the way any nation responds when strangers begin building permanent structures on land that belongs to it. The raids that followed were not random terror. They followed a pattern that Texas Ranger survivors and military historians have traced carefully across the documentary record. The Comanche raided at the full moon, when they could ride at night, when the light was enough for speed and direction, but not enough for long-range shooting by settlers with rifles. The men of the frontier called this the Comanche Moon, and they learned to dread it the way farmers dread a dry spring. Raiding parties would sweep in from the north or northwest, driving off horses, killing the men who resisted, taking captives, women, and children especially, who could be ransomed or adopted into the nation. They would be gone before dawn, riding hard back toward the Llano Estacado, crossing the limestone escarpment where the terrain made pursuit by men on foot or on slower horses effectively impossible. The rangers who went after them lost those pursuits. Almost every time. The horses that mattered most, the best, fastest horses, had already been taken. John Coffee Hayes had watched this happen. He had watched companies of rangers ride out after Comanche raiding parties and come back days later with nothing but tired horses and a sharper understanding of their own limitations. He was not a man given to accepting limitations, but he was also not a fool. And there is a difference between courage and the specific kind of willful blindness that gets men killed when they insist that what isn't working will eventually work if done harder. Hayes looked at the problem the way an engineer looks at a failed structure. He tried to find where the load was being applied wrong. What he understood, what he was working toward in those camps along the Guadalupe and the Llano in 1840 and 1841, was that the Rangers were losing for identifiable reasons. They were armed with single-shot flintlock rifles and pistols that required them to stop, dismount, and reload after every shot. The Comanche were armed with bows that could be fired continuously from horseback. The Rangers were riding horses bred for work on eastern farms and roads, horses that were slower and less agile over rough terrain than the Comanche horses, which had been selectively bred and trained for exactly this country for generations. The Rangers were fighting in the Comanche's country, on the Comanche schedule, against warriors who had trained for this kind of war since childhood. Every structural advantage belonged to the other side. Two things changed this, and both of them mattered. And the story of how they changed it is where this account becomes something more than a military history. The first thing that changed it was a weapon. The second was harder to name. In 1839, a Texas Ranger named Samuel Walker was in New York City. He was there to consult with Samuel Colt, a 25-year-old gunmaker from Hartford, Connecticut, whose patent revolving pistol had failed commercially and whose company had recently gone bankrupt. Colt's revolver was not a new idea. Multi-shot firearms had been attempted for decades with limited success. But Colt had developed a reliable mechanism that allowed a single pistol to fire 5 shots without reloading, using a rotating cylinder that advanced automatically with each cock of the hammer. The problem was that the early model, the Patterson revolver, was fragile and complicated to load under pressure. Walker had used the Patterson in Texas. He had seen what it could do. He had also seen what it couldn't do, had watched men fumble with the loading lever while a fight was already decided around them. He told Colt what needed to change. The cylinder needed to be larger. 6 shots, not 5. The trigger guard needed to be stronger. The loading mechanism needed to work with one hand, under fire, on horseback. Colt had gone bankrupt partly because he was making a weapon that no one in the eastern United States had found a practical use for. Walker told him there was a market, and it was in Texas, and it would buy every revolver Colt could make if the weapon was right. The result was the Walker Colt, a .44 caliber 6-shot revolver that weighed 4.5 pounds, was 9 inches long, and could drop a horse at 100 yards. Colt delivered 1,000 of them to the United States Army in 1847, but the weapon had been in Ranger hands before that, and what the Rangers did with it in the years between 1844 and 1847 changed the arithmetic of every fight they entered. A Ranger with 2 Walker Colts on his belt had 12 shots before he needed to reload. Against warriors using bows, against the speed and mobility of mounted Comanche fighters, 12 shots was not enough to guarantee victory. But it was enough to make a fight possible where before there had been only a slaughter. The second thing that changed, the thing harder to name, was knowledge. It is documented across Ranger diaries, memoirs, military reports, and the accounts of men who rode with Hayes in the early 1840s that the Rangers were, from the beginning, in the process of learning from the people they were fighting. Not formally, not through any program or policy. Through proximity, through observation, through captives who came back and told what they had seen, through the handful of men who had lived among Comanche bands for periods of time and returned, and most directly through the fights themselves, which taught the men who survived them an education no schoolhouse could have provided. The Rangers learned to ride the way the Comanche rode, leaning low, using the horse's body as cover. They learned to read the country the way the Comanche read it, to see the draws and arroyos not as obstacles, but as cover and ambush ground. They learned to travel light, to carry enough for 3 days in a saddlebag and no more, because a man carrying too much could not ride fast enough to matter. They learned, above all, to fight mounted, moving, never stopping, because a Ranger who stopped to fight on foot was a Ranger who was about to be surrounded. None of this learning came without cost. The cost was paid in men, and in the kind of knowledge that only loss produces. The first Ranger commanders who went out against the Comanche and came back diminished, or did not come back at all, had taught the men who followed them something that could not be put in an order of battle or written in a field manual. They had taught them the specific shape of what didn't work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The fight that matters most of this account, the one that the Rangers themselves talked about afterward as the moment something fundamental changed, happened in the summer of 1844 near a creek in the hill country called Walker's Creek, named for that same Samuel Walker who had gone to Colt. Hayes had 15 men. The Comanche force that came against them numbered somewhere between 60 and 80 warriors, though the counts vary across the sources that describe it. The most detailed account comes from a Ranger named Samuel Reed, who rode in the fight and wrote about it years later. The most careful historical analysis of those accounts has been done by historian Robert Utley, whose work on the Rangers remains one of the most authoritative treatments of the period. What Reed described, and what Utley's analysis confirms in its essential shape, was a fight that began as every previous Ranger fight with a Comanche force had begun. The two groups met. The Comanche warriors demonstrated their horsemanship, wheeling their horses, calling out, taunting in ways that had reliably drawn Rangers into charges that the warriors then retreated from, pulling the Rangers out of formation into terrain where they could be surrounded. Hayes had seen this before. He had watched other men follow the retreat and lose the fight. He held his position. He waited. The warriors came closer. One of them, by multiple accounts, came close enough to throw a lance that passed between two Rangers and stuck in the ground. Hayes still held. What happened next is documented in Ranger accounts as the moment the Comanche warriors realized something had changed. Hayes ordered the charge, not a pursuit of retreating warriors, but a charge directly into the main body. His men were carrying the Patterson revolvers by this point, earlier than the Walker Colts, but already enough to change what a mounted charge could do. They rode into the Comanche line firing, and they did not stop when they needed to reload because there was nothing to reload. The cylinder turned. The next shot was there. Warriors who expected the Rangers to stop and fumble with powder and ball found instead men, still firing, still coming, still mounted and moving. The Comanche line broke. It reformed twice more, and each time Hayes ordered another charge rather than falling back to reload, and each time the line broke again. The fight lasted 2 hours by some accounts, less than one by others. When it was over, somewhere between 20 and 50 Comanche warriors were dead, depending on whose count you accept, and Hayes had lost one man. The Comanche did not stop fighting. To say that Walker's Creek ended the conflict or turned the tide in any permanent way would be to misrepresent what the historical record shows. The raids continued through the 1840s. The Great Raid of 1840, when a Comanche force of several hundred warriors swept all the way to the Gulf Coast, burning Linville and driving off horses and captives on a scale that stunned the young republic, had already happened before Walker's Creek. The retaliatory battle at Plum Creek, where Republic of Texas forces caught the returning raiders burdened with plunder and inflicted heavy casualties, had happened in August of that same year. The violence was not a line that ran in one direction. It was a long, grinding, mutual catastrophe. But Walker's Creek entered Ranger memory as a turning point because it was the first time the men who were there could say, without exaggeration, that they had fought a Comanche force on Comanche terms and won. The revolving pistol made that possible. Hayes's patience, his refusal to be baited into a pursuit that would scatter his men, made it possible too. And the men who rode out of that fight carried something home with them that was harder to quantify than a casualty count. The knowledge that the arithmetic could change, that the gap between what a ranger could do and what a Comanche warrior could do was not fixed, that it was a variable that could be worked. The question of who Jack Hayes was as a man and not just a commander matters here because the rangers he shaped reflected his particular qualities in ways that shaped everything that followed. He was born in Wilson County, Tennessee, in 1817, the grandson of a man who had known Andrew Jackson. He had come to Texas at 19, orphan young, trained as a surveyor, and arrived in a republic that had been independent for exactly 1 year and was already at war on two fronts, with Mexico to the south and with the Comanche to the north and west. He was not large. Contemporary descriptions emphasize his slight build, his quiet manner, his apparent youth. Men who first met him in the field were sometimes taken aback by how ordinary he looked. They adjusted their assessment quickly. What Hayes brought to Ranger Command that was unusual, and the historical record is consistent on this, was a quality the men who served under him returned to again and again in their own accounts. He listened. To his men, to the terrain, to the Comanche themselves, insofar as he could learn from watching them fight. He did not arrive with fixed conclusions. He arrived with questions, and the questions were practical ones. Why did the last fight go wrong? What would have made it go differently? What does this man know that I don't? One of his most documented practices was the use of Lapon Apache scouts, men who had their own long grievances against the Comanche and who knew the country and the patterns of Comanche movement in ways that no Anglo-settler could replicate. Other Ranger commanders had used Indian scouts before Hayes. Hayes used them differently, giving weight to what they said rather than filtering it through assumptions he had already made. This posture, the willingness to learn from people who knew more than he did, was not common among Anglo military commanders on the Texas frontier. It was not common in the United States Army, whose officers, trained in the traditions of European linear warfare, tended to approach the irregular fighting of the plains with a confidence in their own methods that the plains consistently punished. The record of Army engagements with Comanche forces through the 1840s and into the 1850s is a record of that confidence being corrected expensively. Hayes and the Rangers he trained learned faster, partly because they were closer to the problem, partly because they had no institutional orthodoxy to protect, and partly because Hayes himself seems to have understood that being wrong, and learning from it was not a failure, but a method. The irony at the heart of this story, and is the kind of irony that good frontier history tends to produce, is that the Rangers became effective against the Comanche in direct proportion to how much they came to resemble them. Lighter, faster, more mobile. Fighting mounted, hitting hard, retreating before the enemy could organize a response. Reading the country as cover rather than terrain. These were Comanche principles, transferred imperfectly but recognizably. The weapon that made the difference was an American invention, but the tactics that made the weapon useful were, in their essential character, learned from the people the Rangers were fighting. That learning went in the other direction too, though this is less well documented in the Anglo sources and more visible in Comanche accounts and the careful work of historians working from Spanish, Mexican, and oral records. The Comanche who fought the Rangers in the 1840s were not the same force, tactically, that had destroyed the Presidio's horse herd on the San Saba River in 1759. They had been watching and adapting for 100 years. They had incorporated European horses, European trade goods, European firearms where they could get them. The revolving pistol was something new, something that appeared in their enemies' hands and changed what a fight looked like before they had time to prepare for it. The accounts of Walker's Creek from the Comanche side are fragmentary, filtered through interviews done decades later, but they are consistent on one point. The number of shots was wrong. The men charging them should have stopped. They did not stop. This was not something the warriors had a trained response for, because it had never happened before. The years after Walker's Creek did not bring peace. The historical record does not support that reading. What they brought was a slow, terrible recalibration on both sides, each trying to account for what the other had added to the fight. The Comanche began, where they could, to acquire repeating firearms of their own. The Rangers continued to refine their methods, pressing further west, learning more of the country, absorbing through painful experience the lessons that the Comanche had spent generations acquiring by right of birth. The Army, watching what the Rangers were doing, began to send officers to learn from them, and some of those officers, men like William Bigfoot Wallace, and later the officers of the 2nd Cavalry established in Texas in 1855, carried what they learned west into the broader fight on the plains. What happened to the principles of this story in the years that followed is documented, though not always in the ways that popular memory has chosen to remember it. John Coffee Hayes commanded the Rangers through the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, leading a regiment of Texas mounted volunteers in the campaign that ended in the capture of Mexico City. He was by all accounts a capable conventional commander, but his reputation rested on the irregular frontier fighting of the previous decade, and the men who served under him in Mexico were a rougher element than the Army had bargained for. General Winfield Scott, commanding the American forces in Mexico, reportedly said of the Texas Rangers that they were too good at war to be comfortable around. After the war, Hayes went to California during the gold rush, served as the first sheriff of San Francisco County, and eventually as the Indian superintendent for Utah Territory. He died in Piedmont, California, in 1883, 65 years old, and was buried there. He had outlived most of the men he had ridden with and most of the world those men had known. Samuel Walker, whose partnership with Samuel Colt had produced the revolver that changed the arithmetic at Walker's Creek, did not live to see the full consequence of what he had helped create. He was killed at the Battle of Huamantla in Mexico in October of 1847, shot from his horse during a cavalry charge. He was 30 years old. The Walker Colt continued to be manufactured long after he was gone. It became the template for the line of Colt revolvers that would arm the frontier through the Civil War and into the era that followed it. The Comanche Nation continued to dominate the southern plains through the 1850s and into the 1860s, surviving the establishment of the state of Texas in 1845 and the years of the Civil War, when the Army withdrew from the frontier forts and the Comanche raided deeper into settled territory than they had in years. What ended Comanche power on the plains was not military defeat in the conventional sense, though the Red River War of 1874 was its final act. When it was the buffalo. In the early 1870s, hide hunters working with long-range Sharps rifles began systematically killing the southern buffalo herd at a rate that the animals could not recover from. Within 3 years, the southern herd, which had numbered in the tens of millions when Hayes was a boy, was functionally gone. The Comanche economy, the Comanche way of life, the entire material civilization of the southern plains was built on the buffalo. Remove the buffalo, and the entire structure failed. The last free Comanche bands, under Quanah Parker, surrendered in 1875 and were confined to a reservation in southwestern Oklahoma. Parker's mother, Cynthia and Parker, had been taken captive in a Comanche raid in 1836 when she was 9 years old. She had grown up Comanche, married a chief named Peta Nakona, and become the mother of the last great Comanche War leader. She was retaken by Texas Rangers in 1860 and never adjusted to Anglo life. She died, by most accounts, of grief. Her story, and her son's, is the kind of story that the frontier tells over and over. That the line between peoples is never as fixed as the men drawing it on maps believe it to be. There is a museum in the town of Waco, Texas, that holds some of the physical artifacts of this story. Ranger equipment from the 1840s. A Walker Colt, its barrel worn smooth from handling, its mechanism still intact 2 centuries after a gunmaker in Connecticut sat across from a Ranger veteran and listened to what a fight on horseback actually required. You can look at the weapon and understand, more or less, what it changed. The weapon is small. The change it represents is not. The hill country along the Guadalupe and Llano rivers, where Hayes and his men camped in those early years, still looks, in certain places, more or less as it looked in 1840. The live oaks are there, the cedar, the limestone outcrops where a man could put his back and watch the country. The country that the Comanche knew as thoroughly as any people has ever known a landscape. The country that the Rangers were learning to read letter by letter while the Comanche had long since read every word, is still there. What is not there, what the landscape does not carry anymore, is the particular kind of silence that preceded those early fights. The silence where a man sitting with his back against a live oak in the dark could hear the horses shifting at their ropes and know that the horses were telling him something and not yet know what. That silence lasted for about 20 years while both peoples were learning each other, while the Rangers were becoming something that had not existed before, and while the Comanche Nation was discovering that the world it had built so brilliantly and so thoroughly was about to be unmade. Not by the Rangers specifically, not by any single force, but by the combined weight of numbers, of repeating firearms, and of the systematic destruction of the animal on which everything the Comanche had built ultimately depended. The Rangers who rode with Hayes in those early years did not know how the story ended. They knew only the fight they were in, the camp they would break before dawn, the country they were riding into and did not yet know well enough. They were learning. The learning cost them. Some of them paid with their lives. The ones who survived paid with something harder to name, the knowledge of what that country could do to a man who did not respect it, who did not listen, who assumed that what had worked somewhere else would work here. Hayes understood this from the beginning, or came to understand it faster than most. The record shows a commander who adjusted, who absorbed what the country and the enemy were teaching, who did not insist on being right about the things he had been wrong about. In the long history of the Texas frontier, that quality was rarer than courage, and in the end, more valuable. The names that belong to this story are not all famous ones. Most of the Rangers who rode with Hayes in the early 1840s left behind little more than a line in a muster roll or a brief mention in someone else's account. They were young men, most of them from Tennessee and Kentucky and the older southern states, come to Texas because Texas was where a man without much money and without a fixed future could find space to become something. Some of them found it. Some of them found an arrow instead, or a rifle ball, or a fever in a camp along a creek that history has not given a name worth remembering. The Comanche warriors who fought them, the men who rode out in the summer full moons and returned with horses, and sometimes captives, who stood on the limestone ridges and watched the ranger camps below, who understood the country they were defending with a specificity that the Rangers spent years trying to match. Most of their names are also lost. Some are recorded in Spanish documents. Some survived in Comanche oral tradition until the tradition itself was disrupted by the reservation years. Some are simply gone, with the world they were part of and the language in which their deeds were first celebrated. What remains is the country, the live oaks and the limestone and the rivers running over stone in the hill country dark. The country that shaped both peoples, that taught both peoples what it would permit and what it would not, that is still there in the long grass south of the Llano Estacado, still turning its particular silence on whoever walks into it. Remember the names it will give you if you listen carefully enough. They are all there if you know which kind of quiet to pay attention to. There is one more thread that the main account does not follow far enough, and it belongs to the men who came after Hayes. When Hayes left Texas for California in 1849, he left behind a generation of Rangers who had been shaped by everything those years had cost and taught. Men like Ben McCulloch and Rip Ford, who carried the methods forward into the 1850s. Men who had ridden with Hayes long enough to have absorbed not just the tactics, but the posture behind them, the particular discipline of not assuming, of watching before acting, of treating the country as a teacher rather than an obstacle. Ford especially continued the work, leading ranger expeditions into the Llano Estacado in the late 1850s that pushed deeper into Comancheria than any Anglo force had gone before, and doing so using methods that Hayes would have recognized. Light, fast, guided by men who knew the terrain, willing to ride toward the problem instead of waiting for the problem to ride toward them. What Ford found when he got there was a Comanche nation that was still powerful, but was beginning to feel, at its edges, the pressure of things no military response could address. The buffalo herds were still vast in the 1850s, still capable of sustaining the plains economy that made Comanche power possible. But the pressure on the margins was constant now, and the margins were moving inward. The settled line was not retreating any more the way it had in the 1820s and 1830s. It was holding and, in some places, advancing, and the Comanche raids that had once cleared the frontier could no longer clear it permanently. Ford's 1858 campaign into the Canadian river country resulted in the Battle of Little Rogue Creek, where his Rangers and their Tonkawa and Caddo allies struck a large Comanche camp under Chief Iron Jacket, a war leader whose name came from the Spanish coat of mail he wore in a battle, a piece of armor looted from some earlier encounter with the Spanish or Mexican frontier and kept across generations as both protection and symbol. Iron Jacket was killed. The camp was destroyed. The fight was a tactical victory by any measure. But Ford, who was not a simple man, wrote afterward that he understood what he had done and what it had not done. He had won a battle. He had not won the country. The country was still Comanche country, and it would remain so until something larger than rangers and battles removed it from them. That something came, as it came for so many nations across the West, not in a single fight, but in the slow arithmetic of extermination, not of people, in this case, but of the animal that was the foundation of everything. The hide hunters with their Sharps rifles did more to end the Comanche world in 3 years than every ranger company combined had managed in 30. Hayes had known how to fight the Comanche. Nobody had found a way to fight what the hide hunters represented, because it was not a fight. It was an erasure. John Ford lived until 1897. He saw the end of the world he had ridden through, saw the Llano Estacado fenced and farmed and stripped of the buffalo that had made it the center of the continent's last great horse empire. He wrote his memoirs. He gave interviews. He tried to explain, to people who had not been there, what the country had been like when it was still itself. Most of them could not quite picture it. The country he was describing was already gone. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.